Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of No One's a Critic. This is our 25th episode, I believe, and we're doing something special again. The second iteration of our movie club tradition. I don't know if it's a tradition. Yeah, we've only done one of them so far, but
Now we've done two. Now it technically is a tradition, I think. Yeah.
technically now it's a tradition. But we're going to be talking about the movie Goodfellas and about Scorsese in general. Now, the reason I brought up that we should do Goodfellas as our second movie club is because Mac had a very special stream last week, I believe it was, where he hit 100,000 subscribers. So, congratulations to you, Mac. You definitely deserve it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so someone had asked me, who's your favorite director? And it's hard because I said Scorsese, but I kind of said with a caveat of honestly, I don't really know how to answer that question. It's almost like someone asking you like what's your favorite movie? It's sort of like that where it's like, well, when I'm talking about a favorite director, are we just talking about a director who has made a lot of films I like, or the most? Like, if I were to like give you my 100 films, my 100 like best films, or what I would think of, and I just like, oh, X, this director has X amount of films. Scorsese would probably be the person. However, then it's like, well, but then do we mean like a director who um is like this one you appreciate, or like even if the films aren't like your favorites, your personal favorites, you really respect them. Do you have a? But if I were to ask you that question, do you have one in mind that you would
It's the
select?
same. It's the same thing you said. I think it would be hard to determine favorite, and I especially we talked about this before. I don't like the concept of like ranking art. I do it
Hmm.
because it's fun to be like, here's my top 10 favorite films or whatever. But it's really hard, especially when you get to like the top two or three. It's like, is one better than the other? It's not this mechanical thing. I'd probably have to say the Coen brothers. I really enjoy their film, and they're
Nice. That's
they're
fair. That's a good one.
they're one of these. I don't know what to call them, directors. They're a team for the most part, but they're one of these people who they have such a distinct style that it just like I get more than just the experience of watching a movie when I watch their things. I'm appreciating not just the story they're telling, but the style and the way they do it. Tarantino would be another one for me too. I really love his films. But we're here to talk about Scorsese. So we're going to talk about Goodfellas just because I've watched that movie 1,000 times. I know every single little detail about it. But we're probably going to also transition to talk about Scorsese's entire catalog, which we're both big fans of a lot of his movies. So do you maybe want to get us started here and maybe share your thoughts on Goodfellas and kind of your impressions of Scorsese's work from that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so kind of like we did with Fight Club, I can kind of give a rundown. It's a bit Goodfellas is more of a. It's sort of like a not really like a. There's not really a plot. I think Scorsese famously said when The Departed came out in 2006, it was the first movie he ever made with a plot. Because a lot of his movies are either like character studies
Yeah, like
or they're
Taxi
sort of like
Driver doesn't have a plot. I mean, it
yeah, or
kind
like
of does, but
Raging
not really.
yeah, it's kind of there, but it's mostly the character study. They're almost kind of like slice of life films,
Yeah, that's a
kind of.
great word for it, slice of life.
Yeah. And then Goodfellas is like the ultimate, like, it's we almost use the story of Henry Hill. So yeah, so Goodfellas is a story of Henry Hill, who was a mob associate in the Italian mafia, and who eventually went on to become a rat. He ended up uh giving over you know, his mob associates or mob mutuals or whatever you would call them. And he's I think he was in the witness protection program, but then he got kicked out of it. I think because he was like they caught him dealing drugs or something, and so now he just like he's old enough where he just like openly like gives interviews about it. I think
Well, he
because like
passed away though, didn't he?
oh, did he?
I think he did.
Let's see. Oh yeah, he died in 2012. Leading up to that, I know because I remember I used to watch it because sometimes when they would show Goodfellas on like AMC, they would intercut with interviews of Henry Hill. So yeah, at some point he was just like, fuck it, everyone who everyone who I was like associated with is like dead. I'm just gonna like start giving interviews for money and whatnot. Um but yeah, I'm trying to think. I think I first saw Goodfellas. I think I was more familiar with Scorsese's other stuff, Raging Bull and Taxi Driver first. Those are like the big, The Departed, of course, the more contemporary ones. I think my cousins, my uncle had Goodfellas on DVD when I was probably like 15, 16 when I saw it. And it was just, I didn't, it's a movie I didn't really appreciate when I first saw it, but now I look back and I'm like, it's in terms of pacing, I think that is one film where it's like 2.5 hours feels like an hour. It's just
I could
unbelievably
literally.
done.
I know we say this all the time, but this is a movie I could literally watch like every single day of my life, and I would never get bored of it. And it's. I love the phrase you used to describe it, slice of life, because, and this is something we could talk about for Scorsese in general, because I've had this thing where I really respect him as a director, and I respect his style and stuff like that. But when I try to actually quantify like what makes Goodfellas a good film, I have a hard time, because it is a little bit of a character study of Henry Hill, but he's not that deep of a character, right? We're just kind of going through his life. We're not. There's not like these deep dramatic beats. With something like Taxi Driver, there's more of that kind of stuff. But with Goodfellas, it's just you're just kind of along for the ride, just enjoying it. But the atmosphere that he creates in the film is just so like easy to like watch. It's so easy to engage with. Like you said, the 2 hours just flies by, and it's just a thoroughly like entertaining, and to me a little bit almost like relaxing film to watch. It's just like almost meditative how engrossed I become in his life.
It's well, and that's like sort of like the whole shtick where this actually was one of the things that Scorsese got flack about for, and I actually shared this critique with Wolf of Wall Street. Have you seen Wolf of Wall
Oh
Street?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I would argue, and it's not so much of like it's in a textual thing, like an actual like in the text of the script. I would argue that Wolf of Wall Street doesn't do that good of a job of really dressing down Jordan's like
Hmm.
the lifestyle of Jordan Belfort. So for those who don't know, he was a stockbroker and he fucked over like a bunch of innocent people and he made millions, and then he got caught by the FBI. It's almost as if like while I was watching the film, it almost like I don't know. There's a certain self awareness in Goodfellas where, from the very beginning, the film is basically telling you like these are not good guys.
Yeah.
Like these are like the mobsters are not good people. They are not people you want to emulate. This is not a lifestyle that you want.
Hmm.
But the reason it works is because we're seeing it like because it starts the opening line of the film. Ever since I can remember, I've always wanted to be a gangster.
Yeah.
The reason that it comes off like this is because we're seeing this lifestyle through the eyes of a kid who like emulated these guys.
Yeah.
So there's always this sort of like backhanded irony where a great example is in the when he's it's during before we cut to Ray Liotta when he's still a kid. There's a scene where he basically like defends Paulie, who's like the mob boss. He's
Hmm.
like all Paulie does is just offer protection for people who can't go to the cops.
Yeah.
And it's like, gee, That's like now that we've seen Sopranos, we're like, gee, Henry, offer protection from who?
Yeah.
And so like, there's always this sort of like wink, wink of like Henry's account of the life is
Yeah.
very. It's almost like he's almost like a quasi unreliable narrator in a
Oh,
sense
definitely
because
he
we're
is.
seeing it. Yeah.
I felt that too, because it's also helped the more I learn the real history of Henry Hill. Um, I watch Michael Francis on YouTube. He was another big mob guy who went to jail, reformed or whatever, and now he does YouTube videos and podcasts and stuff about his time in the mob. He's talked a lot about Henry Hill, like not disrespectfully, but like it's not nearly as glamorous. Henry Hill's life was not nearly as glamorous as what was portrayed in the movie, and I don't know how much of that is the fact that they just based it off of Henry Hill's story, which was told through Nicholas Plage's book Wise Guy, which I actually have on the shelf behind me. So I don't know how much of it is the fact that they based it on his testimony versus how much of it was they are intentionally trying to show that, like, yeah, Henry, this is like Henry Hill's memory of his life. It's he looks much better in the movie than he does in real life. The grandeur of what they did was a lot higher than what he did. But even in the film itself, I always felt like it felt like Henry Hill was almost a little bit more of a bit character within the plot. It was much more of like Jimmy Burke and Tommy, I forget his last name, but the Joe Pesci character were
Tommy
almost more
DeVito.
the more the drivers of like the mob stuff, and he was just kind of along for the ride. So I think it was very much intentional to show that, yeah, this isn't meant to be as glamorizing, especially in comparison to what mob movies were before Goodfellas, which is like the Godfather era, which really kind of glamorized the life, made it this operatic kind of drama of like honorable men. There's much more of an element of realism there to the horrible way that they treat other people and each other.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Godfather because obviously I've heard many people refer to as Goodfellas as the anti-Godfather. I think some heavy. I almost would argue that like Goodfellas was the start of like a new era where like the mob and there were films before that that sort of like dressed down the mob and organized crime, but Goodfellas was because again like the Godfather had such an impact on pop culture. Like our perception of mob, like it literally changed our perception of mobs. It changed the mob's perception of mobsters, where they started sort of like thinking of themselves as like Sopranos, like we're quoting The Godfather, hey, like but the Goodfellas was like the first time it was like, oh wow, these are just a bunch of like fat guys just running around, like just like muscling people, and they just because they wear suits, they think that they're hot shit. Um, and funny enough, yeah, so, like, The Godfather, even though that film, as much upon rewatching it, I do think that the sort of operatic nature of it is almost there is a hint of irony of it. It's like it's almost self-aware of, like, no it's nothing personal, Sonny, but everything in the film is personal. Like, it's just business, but, like, nothing in the film is just business. So there is that irony there. But Goodfellas was just so unapologetic in showing just just how they're all just so like everything's like gaudy and just so like the scene where they show the mob wives and they have like pounds of makeup on. It just seems yeah, it just is really or they're just like in like these like crappy little um like clubs and they're just playing cards. Like it's not this like they're not like an easy chair smoking cigars with like brandy or something.
I had to say, Lorraine Bracco walking, like yelling at him in the street when he doesn't show up for the date. One of the like sexiest like women I've ever seen in my life. That in her in that scene, like that's just she looked incredible.
It's so funny that you say that because that is actually if someone asked me like what's your favorite movie line of all time, it's that scene where after Henry stands up Karen, she Tommy drives her and she gets out like you got some nerve
Yeah.
standing me up.
Who you think
And then
you are,
she
Henry Hill, or some kind of big shot?
who do you think you are, Frankie Valley or
Or
something?
Frankie
And
Bass?
like
Sorry, I fucked it up.
just the way she says it and the inflection is
I
just like
fucked up the line. Fuck me.
it's close enough. But it's like Frankie Valley or some kind of bit like
Frankie
her
Valley, or
delivery
some
of it.
kind of big shot? Yeah, yeah. The hype
She
ass.
was she was fantastic. Or the scene where after at the end of the film when she flushes the drugs and then Henry finds out and then she has like I'm sorry like she's unbelievable in it.
I mean, she's just incredible. Like she nails like the crazy hot, like I mean, both of those words, hot and crazy vibe that she gives off in a lot of that movie. In real life, she was actually, or the real Karen Hill was actually having an affair with Paulie, the Paulie character, the boss. So again, it's not this idyllic life that he kind of again portrayed in the film, but again, showing the ugliness of he could be abusive to her. He slapped her that one time when she put a gun in his face. I think I mean I don't want to talk too much about The Godfather just because we're here to talk about Scorsese and Goodfellas, but I love Godfather. It's one of my top 10 favorite films, but it's almost not really a mob movie. Like it's more of like a Shakespearean. opera that just happens to be about the mob. Like we don't even really see how the mob operates. We don't see any of their like crimes and how they make their money. Again, and I've read uh, Coppola's preface to the Godfather book, where he talked about making of the film, and he said originally he wasn't really interested in adapting the book until he kind of started thinking of it as like Vito Corleone was a king who had three sons who each had a different part of his personality, and again, that Shakespearean kind of historical drama, I think, is more colors the Godfather more, but Goodfellas shows much more of like the logistics of how the mob operates, and again, there's that element of realism there.
And it's amazing. Yeah, it's and another what I love about the film so much is how it's able to highlight all these elements of mob life. Like they talk about bust outs, they talk about protection money, all this stuff, but it's done in a way where the story kind of it doesn't just feel like someone's like just telling you, hey, this is what the mob was, this is what they did. It just flows so amazing. Like that's whenever I'm talking about pacing and film on my channel or storytelling, it it's hard to quantify because like people ask like, well, what makes good pacing, and it's very difficult to sort of like put your finger on it. It's the best way I can describe it is like it's just flow. It's just when you're watching the film, you just kind of it's like you said, is it a film where if you just put it on and then you don't realize, oh shit, like 30 minutes have gone by because I just got caught up in it, and it's hard to quantify sometimes. It's a lot easier to to notice bad pacing than really good pacing. I think Goodfellas is one of the just sometimes the scenes will jump like years, and it just feels it you just keep watching. It's just, oh, I know exactly what's going on. I know what's happening. It's it's like a borderline miracle film.
I think again, yeah, Scorsese. That almost I think is the thing that defines him for me as a director. He, like I said, a lot of his movies I have a hard time explaining what exactly I like about them. We'll talk about some of the other films he has on here too, but um, yeah, they're not all like again deep character stuff, but they flow so well. And I think one of his like obviously signature things is like narration, right? He has his characters doing voiceover, which for another director could be a very cheap move, right? It can be like we a lot of people complain about the Blade Runner voiceovers and stuff like that. It's like it's unnecessary. It's a cheap way to explain a film. But Scorsese again, because his movies have this almost like dreamlike quality where they're just kind of flowing through. It seems to just tie everything together and just make it very digestible and very easy to watch.
Like you said, we're almost like watching like a recollection of someone's memory, as opposed to, um, yeah, and it and funny enough, that's something in Wolf of Wall Street I don't think was. I think it tried to recapture the magic of Goodfellas with the narration and stuff. It was shot in a very similar style, but for some reason it just didn't land for me. It's still a great film,
Yeah,
a very well made
I
film.
agree with you on the Wolf of Wall Street where it doesn't seem like Jordan gets the kind of comeuppance he should for the story. I wonder again how much of that is like the real Jordan Belfort. Also, I don't feel like he got the comeuppance he probably deserved. He did a little bit of time in jail and now does podcasts and does book tours and stuff like that. He's kind of lived that life, and I think that's what the movie was going for to an extent. Like you saw at the end, like the FBI agent who arrested him, he's still riding the subway home, and a whole generation of these like finance dude bros who are like all about money and fucking success and shit like that have kind of you know elevated Jordan Belfort up as like this kind of hero of like the scumbag alpha male finance guy, which again that might be the realistic answer there because again it seems that happens more often than not that the people who deserve to be punished for doing stuff like this often don't.
Yeah, and it's strange because like the final shot of the film obviously is like meant to like drive that home, like it's supposed to, like the ending is supposed to be kind of ironic. how he goes through all this and fucks over so many people, but then at the end he's giving lectures and it shows the people in the audience, and it's like I appreciate those touches, but I just don't, for some reason with Goodfellas, it just works perfectly. And funny enough, as like you mentioned on the real life story, how Karen was actually fucking Paulie, the mob boss, who in the film is portrayed as like a very loving father figure to Henry. What's ironic about that is that I actually think Wolf of Wall Street, to its critique, it doesn't frame Jordan Belfort as a good guy, but I think it does try to frame him at least somewhat like at the end when he makes a deal with the FBI. It kind of doesn't really, I don't know, it just doesn't really sink in that like how much of like a scumbag he was. Like he didn't actually care about like Jordan Belfort. If you actually like watch interviews, like when people like confront him about it, it's like, well, I wanted to do the right thing. It's like, no, you didn't. Like, come on, like that you did not give a shit about these people. You don't give a shit. Let's be honest here. Um, and I don't think that comes across as well in the film. I think in part because I think he was like involved, so he may have been like, hey, don't make me like that much of a dipshit. Um, but with Goodfellas, it actually makes him. There are scenes in Goodfellas. The example is when Tommy shoots Spider. Henry is like the only one who looks like he's actually remorseful. I don't know. I highly doubt that. I think that was maybe thrown in there to make him seem like oh, I'm like one of the good ones. It's like he probably did not give a shit. He didn't give like he didn't give a shit all the other times they committed crimes. But what I like about Goodfellas is at the end, they the fact when Henry turns on Jimmy and Paulie, it's like 100% like he's just a scumbag. He's just like a rat, just trying to get away with it. And they don't romanticize it. They don't try to make it like, oh well, he had a good reason. Like no, he was just he's the whole movie is like talking about like never, and the opening scene, never rat on your friends, always keep your mouth shut. And then at the end, he just I'll rat on my friends.
No, yeah. I mean, it was because they were trying to kill him and stuff. But again, he also violated the rules about drugs. He was just out to make money. And again, who knows why people do things in real life? But I definitely agree with you. There's that element of like, at the end of the movie, he's like, now I'm just a schmuck like everyone else. That's the fate worse than death for him of just like I gotta live like a normal life now, which he didn't end up living after all. He got out of the witness protection, but it's still a great way to end the film. um the very very final shot of the film where Tommy shoots the gun,
Hmm.
which is a reference to the Great Train Robbery, which is one of the very first films ever made. An old school silent film, shows a cowboy pointing a gun at the camera. This is like when cameras were first invented, right? um I've always not known exactly what to think about that. It seemed like maybe Scorsese was trying to say something. But again, I don't know exactly what it was he was trying to say.
Oh, with the final shot of Tommy shooting the gun.
Shooting a gun, yeah.
I think it kind of reflects on, it kind of was trying to do what I think it did what Wolf of Wall Street was trying to do, but in a much better fashion. And kind of like you pointed out perfectly with Henry's final line. Instead of him saying like, yeah, man, I'm just glad I learned my lesson and got over it, he laments that like, oh, now I'm just like a regular sucker who has to like actually like work for money. The and like that's another instance of like the movie being very self-aware of, we're watching this story unfold through the eyes of a character who's kind of he's not a good person. He's actually has like a very warped perception of the mob life. He's not like a it, the and that's actually why I think the narration works, because he's not just telling us stuff that's happening. He's almost putting everything that we're seeing, all the horror and bloodshed and killing, through almost like a filter. It's like, oh well, this is why we did this, and like, well, we had to do this, and it's like, I don't really know. But yeah, I think that last shot is supposed to signify. Funny enough, Tarantino mentioned this when he was making Pulp Fiction. Um, he said, paraphrasing, of course, the American gangster films are sort of a satire of the American dream. And so I think that was sort of the irony of like, even though Henry is like, and ironically enough, he ended up getting out of the witness protection program and doing drugs again, or stealing drugs. And then now he made a living up until his death off of his history. So it's almost as if it's like this, even though the film is showing that this lifestyle is awful and terrible and it's dressing it down, it still is almost poking fun at the fascination that people have of it. It's like, we know it's bad, we know we don't would never want to live this life, but also it's kind of like we do have a romanticization of it.
Yeah, I could see that. It definitely goes, like I said, along with the rest of the themes of the film. Um, I'd love to maybe talk a little bit too about some of his other films. So, I mean, you cited him as the closest thing to a favorite director for you. What kind of stands out for you as like,
I mean, Taxi Driver was like the first. It was like, it's such a cliche, but it was a film where it was it. I think that it was one of the first films where I watched it. And I remember, I think the first, because like when I was first coming into film, I was always, I was raised on, like I went to like movies on Fridays. So all the movies I saw were like, very traditional three act structure, run of the mill stuff. And as I saw all these movies, um, I didn't, I didn't like, I wasn't able to put it into these words of like, oh, three act structure and like the first act and the midpoint and stuff. But like once you absorb a lot of movies, you kind of like start to see the patterns. Taxi Driver for me, when I first watched it, I remember hating it because it didn't fall into that pattern. I was watching it, I'm like, why, what is going on? It's just this dude. Like, there's nothing happening. Um, but then as I got older, and that was sort of like the breakthrough for me when I started to realize, oh, not every film has to follow this like beat by beat plot progression. This is more of a character study. And funny enough, now that I've gotten older and rewatched the film, I I actually do think it follows a traditional three act structure, but it was just done so. I think who said that? Billy Wilder said the more well hidden your plot points, the better writer you are. Like, you don't want your plot points or like the act breaks to be very like in your face, like, oh, we have to go on this adventure. Like sometimes that doesn't hurt, but the more sort of subtle they can be, it shows that you're a good record, a good writer. Have you seen Taxi
I
Driver?
seen
You said.
Taxi Driver, yeah, and I really liked it. Again, it had that very dreamlike quality to it, where you're like you're not sure what's real, and it kind of very much fits with his character because he suffers from insomnia. He's driving a taxi all night, going to movies, so we're not sure exactly like is what's happening to him real? Is he actually experiencing? Is it just a delusion? He's very clearly a troubled individual who's got a lot of problems. Yeah, again, I'd have a hard time, breaking down what the plot points are and what the structure is, because again, we're just following this guy for the most part, and he's a very interesting character, very likable at times character, but also a very dark and weird person. Which again, I mean, this movie inspired a whole generation of subsequent films about kind of characters like this. Obviously, one of the famous ones of our time, Joker. Again, the stories of these troubled individuals, and we're following them, and we have sympathy for them, but we also, they take it too far. But I mean, obviously, considered one of the best films of all time for a very good reason.
It's definitely like the OG, like lonely young man, isolated young man role or film, where Travis, and that's a film where it kind of that's one film where I've heard a lot of takes from like sort of film bros where I'm like, whoa, like I think you empathize with Travis a little bit too much because the film makes it very clear that he's like varied. But on that note, I think the film does such a good job of like, so like there's that moment at and the third act where we're watching Travis, we're seeing him unravel, and there's that final shot where, not the final shot, but the shot where he's at the rally, and then we just see we just see below his neck, so it's like just his torso, and he's eating a piece of gum, and then as he goes to chew the piece of gum, the camera pans up, and we see that he's shaved his head into the mohawk, and that was the moment where you're sort of like, oh shit, oh no, he's unhinged, like, because up until then you're like, oh no, here's this nice guy, and he's trying to help Iris, and he's like, his reactions to the world around him are somewhat, that's sort of the irony, and like that's the end of the film, where is Travis the crazy one, or are we the crazy ones? For because it, you would think that, like, oh, Iris, like, what, she's a 12-year-old prostitute, anyone who's like is like normal or like not crazy, you would think this is fucked up, this has to stop, and yet everyone else treats it as if it's like, yeah, it's just something that happens. And it almost makes a good point of like, you almost get so desensitized to, or like, or rather, how can you not go crazy in a society like this? How can any sane person deal with this day to day? Um, yeah, it's just unbelievable film.
I also like, obviously Robert De Niro, right? That's an incredible role for him, and I almost forget sometimes like just how diverse an actor he was, especially in his early years. Like
Hmm.
he really had a range of performances. He kind of, as he went on, got locked more into like the gruff mobster, stern kind of role, in the same way Joe Pesci did. The more and more he went on, but god damn, some of his early roles like this, Raging Bull, um, just incredibly vulnerable performances. Even with having machismo and stuff like that. Like Raging Bull is the one I watched for the first time fairly recently, and I was blown away by that, of how, again, a very unhinged character who. I'm not sure how much sympathy I'm supposed to have for the guy. Like clearly, like there's stuff that went wrong in his life, and there's stuff that I can feel bad for him for, but also just the way he carries himself and the decisions he makes are just like, I'm scared of this guy. I would be scared to be around him of how unhinged he is. And that's obviously a fantastic movie as well, Raging Bull.
That's one where people, I think that's actually one where I, even as when I was younger, or one of the big critiques of it that I've heard even to this day is like, why I don't like this film because he's so unlikable. That like Travis was a character who's like, you're not supposed to emulate him. The film is clear that he's not a good person. He's unhinged. He's like mentally ill. He's prejudiced. But like, you still feel there's still enough there where you can still relate to him. Jake LaMotta is a character where they just were like, we're just going to show you it, like right out of the gate, like this guy is a monster. He isn't just a fucking just he's just an irredeemable piece of shit. But the film isn't asking you to sympathize with him. It's asking you to simply, that the famous scene at the end with when he's in the jail cell. It's like, can you still see the humanity within this monster?
Well, that's what I always said. I didn't think Jake was a monster. I thought he was an animal, in the
Yeah,
worst sense of the word. Like I mean, his nickname, right? The Raging Bull. He's like a dumb beast. And there's this thing about him where he can't control himself in the same way that like a rabid dog can't control how violent it is, even though it clearly does. I don't know. I got it. Like he doesn't want to be this awful being that he is, but it's just this animalistic instinct in him. He's got no other kind of way to respond to the world and kind of bite. And so that's the sympathy I had for him. That I pitied him the way I pitied kind of almost an abused animal. Again, how much of that is actual abuse versus how much of that is just his own personal choices is up for debate. But that jailhouse scene where he's like, you stupid animal, you stupid animal. I was like, he felt like an animal caged and about to be like, put down. It was very sad.
and then of course when he destroys his relationship with his brother, because he's obsessed with that like unhinged jealousy of like, no, no, you fuck my wife, and it's such an uncomfortable scene when he's like confronting him, and he's making up this entire narrative Like that's what like breaks your heart is that like obviously like he made his own bed in many ways, but you're watching him destroy his life for nothing. He just can't. He has this jealousy in him that he can't control, and it just alienates him from everything good in his life until he's left at the end by himself. And the film doesn't even, or it doesn't even give like a oh, it turned out okay ending. It's like no, it's actually a very depressing ending. He's alone. He's in a nightclub. Just damn.
It's one of these things that, like, looking back on it now, you can kind of look at the movie in a different way because obviously, right, that my first instinct in watching it now is that he had head trauma from the years of abuse he spent taking shots directly to the head. We know that about people nowadays of like getting hit in the head all the time fucks you up, fucks up your brain, fucks up your personality. So I don't know how much of that was intentional, how much of that was known back in the 80s when the movie came out or 70s. How much cerebral trauma played a factor in that. But I really love the ending scene where he quotes on the waterfront, Marlon Brando, right? One of the most famous lines or speeches in history. I could have been a contender speech, right? It's like Scorsese paying homage to one of the classics of film in general. But the way that De Niro delivers it is this cold, kind of methodical way. Like he's just going through the lines. He doesn't even feel the emotion the way that Brando felt it. I thought it was a great like metatextual way of again like showing the character of Jake and also kind of showing demonstrating kind of Scorsese's style and how it differed from on the waterfront and the kind of early cinema that it represented.
And it's funny too. I'm glad you brought that up because the ending is very. It's somewhat ambiguous in the sense of so the speech that Jake recites at the end is the famous on I could have been a contender speech from On the Waterfront. And the context of the scene is Marlon Brando is talking to his brother, Charlie, and he basically is like telling him, it's like, I when you were my promoter, I could have been a contender, I could have been a good boxer, but you just made me go for like the short end money, like with the gangsters and stuff. And what's so ironic about that is that in the scene where Jake is reciting this, is that it's almost as if like because he's speaking Marlon Brando's part. So when he's saying it, it's like you should have looked out for me. You were my brother. What's funny is that it's the opposite, right? Because it was Joe Pesci, his brother. Like he was always there for him. He was always the one looking out for him. And it's Jake. He's the one who fucked it up. So on one hand, you could say, "Oh, is this Jake almost having like is he slipping back into like his old ways where he's blaming his brother, or he's looking into a mirror? So is it where he's almost like saying it to himself, where he's almost blaming himself?" And the film doesn't really make it clear what exactly Jake's feelings are. Does he actually have the self-awareness now of understanding that he kind of made his own bed, or is he kind of still in this sort of like delusional state of no, it was everyone else that like all my like jealousy and all my actions were justified. And the film doesn't really give you an answer. It kind of lets it open. It almost leaves him as like an enigma of a character in a sense.
And again, I think that's Scorsese's style, especially in those early films that he did. Um, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of his newer work. Like let's start with The Departed because you made two videos about The Departed. And it's interesting. The video you did about it was the first time I ever kind of realized I wouldn't say problem with Scorsese, but like I said before, it was that thing that I couldn't explain about Scorsese that I was like, I like this film, but I kind of don't understand why. And you talked in the film about the problems that it has, and that kind of again contextualized what I liked about Scorsese, like what he does well to cover up the problems of The Departed was what I liked about him as a director that I could just never put into words. So, do you want to share your thoughts about The Departed?
Well, it's funny because I also made a video on Saving Private Ryan, and in that video, I discuss how the actual script, like the actual text of the film, it actually has a lot of problems. Like thematically, it's very dissonant. There's a lot of kind of like cliche scenes. Like the actual text is kind of lame, but Spielberg is such a good director that he's kind of able to make you forget about that and just kind of like get you swept up. The Departed is the same sort of way, where the actual script of The Departed I actually think is pretty fucking shitty. Obviously, it is a remake of a Hong Kong film, Infernal Affairs, the trilogy, yes, and not to say like those films are better. The scripting is tighter, but they're not like the best thing in the world. Like they're kind of still rough around the edges. But The Departed actually makes a lot there are a lot of plot holes in The Departed. There's a lot of things that just straight up do not make any sense. But that's the whole thing where Scorsese is so good. Like the film just flows where you're just watching it and you get caught up and you kind of just don't worry about it. You're just kind of like, I'm being entertained by this film and I don't really know why. I almost think that part of the issue with The Departed is that it kind of had the Goodfellas style, but it was trying to also communicate a plot. I mean, like in simultaneously, and that's kind of why the film just doesn't work for me in terms of. But in terms of direction, excellent. And writing, no. Altogether, it's just kind of a mixed bag.
It's interesting that, again, talking about The Departed, and it made me realize these problems. I kind of felt the same way about Gangs in New York. Like, I watched that movie. I
Yeah.
remember liking it. I also remember being like, I don't really follow what's going on here. Like, there's not. I can't remember the plot of Gangs in New York other than Daniel Day Lewis is fucking amazing, right? In everything he does, he's incredible. But like, the plot is like he's a kid and his father gets killed and he goes to an orphanage and he comes back and he works for the guy. And I just remember being like, I'm not really grounded in the story of what's going on or the characters really, or I don't really get a sense of the trajectory of where it's going. But I did like it. I was like, Daniel Day Lewis is fucking killing it. I just like watching the scenes and stuff like that. So I think it's a similar thing, and it's obviously um, in the same. It's the same kind of time period when he was making The Departed too. That kind of early 2000s era of Scorsese.
Yeah, it was sort of that was a weird era for Scorsese. I think Shutter Island also came out like about a couple years later. Aviator, and they weren't bad films by any means, but it was a bit of sort of like the DiCaprio. I mean, I guess we're still in the DiCaprio era, but like the early days of the DiCaprio era, it was a bit strange. It did seem a bit like his films were like even Gangs in New York, the opening. I remember him using a lot of like slow motion, but like but like not the smooth, like the choppy slow motion. And it kind of felt strange to see him do this. I'm like, or like he's like Scorsese's directing like action, like what's going on here? And like again, maybe it was due to the fact that the Aviator, I haven't seen that in a long time. I remember liking the Aviator more though. And I think the issue is that Gangs of New York, Departed, Shutter Island wasn't bad, but it wasn't like it was more of a film where I was like, okay, it was like a fun watch, but like not a film I would like call home about. But it is interesting how these are all films with like very tight plotting, like or there's like a plot where you're supposed to be kind of paying attention to, but you kind of just watch and you kind of get caught up in it, and you're sort of I think he got better at it, but yeah, Gangs in New York is absolutely that was a film where it's like it almost felt like he didn't care about the story. He just kind of wanted to like direct the scenes and that like the film's a visual marvel. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's so funny that you mentioned it. I'm like, yeah, what does because it's a long film, Gangs in New York, and it's like what does actually happen in that film? And I'm like, I
You're right.
don't remember.
It's just a series of scenes, They look good and are acted well. Like I really love Daniel Day Lewis. I can't emphasize that enough. Liam Neeson, I thought was a little like, I mean, he's Irish, but I just felt kind of out of place. So I was like, what's he doing here?
Yeah,
Um, they had John C. Riley, the comedic actor, in a serious role, but it was a very minor role. Like I was excited by it. I was like, because I love seeing comedians in serious roles, but I felt like they didn't really utilize him that much. He was just kind of like there for a couple of scenes. Again, it was just
yeah,
it feels disconnected, like not really all put together. You're right. It is funny. These are all the DiCaprio era. He traded in De Niro for DiCaprio during the
yeah,
early
and
2000s.
I definitely think the DiCaprio era is a bit of a mixed bag. Maybe it's sort of just like me being a dick. It's like well, he's not De Niro. Um,
I
but yeah,
think
but
there's
even
something to be said for DiCaprio's. There was an era where he was bad, and then there was an era where he was kind of like in between bad and good, and then there was an era like in the modern day where he's undoubtedly good, like really good. Like I
yeah,
think the early 2000s, he was still in that mix, like, but like in between like Titanic and his like
he was
serious career, he was
he
like a
was trying to
mixed
leave
bag.
Pretty Boy. Yeah, he was trying to leave the
Yeah,
Pretty Boy
but
behind,
it was
and
that pretty boy style was still on him, where it's like even in The Departed, I kind of felt that way too. It's like even when he was trying to be unhinged, it was still this kind of glamour model unhinged that I was just like he wasn't able to shake that off until he got a little bit older. And then obviously Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, like the stuff he's got going on right now is just fantastic. But yeah, that early 2000s era of DiCaprio is kind of weird.
yeah, and but it's interesting that like I do appreciate seeing him sort of because when De Niro came on the scene with Scorsese back in the '70s, he was already like in it. He didn't have to like he didn't have to like kind of like find his footing. Like he
No.
was just like he made De Niro was in Mean Streets, Godfather Part Two,
Um, Once Upon a Time in
Novecento.
America.
Well, that was a bit later in '84,
Oh,
but
that
I'm
was. I
I'm
thought it was
talking
earlier. Oh,
but
you're
I'm
right. It
talking about
was later though.
like in the '70s. He was in
Yeah, yeah,
Mean Streets in '73, Godfather Part Two '74, Novecento 1975, Taxi Driver '76, Deer Hunter '78. Like he was just like
yeah.
that was like his. I mean, like Pacino obviously was also there, and a couple others, but De Niro I think was just
Yeah.
like it was just he didn't have to like almost. Oh, they were like good and bad. It's like no,
Hmm.
he was just on it the
Yeah,
entire fucking time.
yeah. I mean, obviously, like DiCaprio was a child actor too. We got to remember that. Like I think he got started in like the Disney Channel or something. Like just not maybe not that, but like he was like a young kid, like doing like kid stuff, like or early teen stuff.
Yeah, I forget where he actually came. Well, he did the Basketball Diaries. That he was actually pretty good in that film.
He was
Oh
on
god,
Growing Pains, the sitcom.
he did
Um,
Romeo. Remember Romeo
yeah,
plus Juliet?
that
Uh,
awful. Yeah, that was such a weird time of like play adaptations. Like I feel like play adaptations for film are still occasionally very weird and very like what the fuck is going on kind of thing. But that one was like the creme de la creme of like Jesus Christ, what the fuck are we doing here?
well, it's so funny because the entire problem with Shakespeare, or I shouldn't say the problem. I understand why it's taught in schools. Like it's like well, kids want to like they have to sort of like decipher the language and like etc. But on the other, there's also a part of me where it's like some of the actual stories of Shakespeare are so fucking badass, like Hamlet, Macbeth, what have you. But because they're so like esoteric and dense, you almost can't like enjoy them as much as you could, because you're like you have to like sift through like what does this phrase mean, and it's like can we just like listen to the story? And what's so funny about Romeo plus Juliet is like instead of like oh we're making a modernized adaptation, and it's like oh so you're gonna keep the same setting but you're gonna make it easily understandable for like younger kids. It's like, no, we're gonna update the setting, but we're gonna keep the script exactly the same. And it's like, bro, like that completely defeats the purpose because now everyone's watching it and it's like, oh, it's got a cool hip setting, but like still no one understands. Me and my girlfriend, funny enough, you mentioned Coen Brothers. We watched the tragedy of Macbeth. About 40 minutes in, my girlfriend turned to me. It's like, I have no idea what the fuck is going on. And it's like, because how can you?
I think like play dialogue is meant to be delivered in a certain way. You're meant to deliver it to a stage of people who are kind of sitting far away, and
Especially Shakespeare.
it's written in a way where it's like you're not meant to like to like deliver a line to a camera where you're like I'm talking like in a normal voice. It sounds weird when you deliver it like that, but when you enunciate it like you're on a stage of like friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Like it works in that way, just because again, that's what we're used to, and that's the way the dialogue was kind of written for. So again, whenever they try to bring it into a film and they try to deliver the lines like a movie, like not screaming at the top of their lungs, it just kind of comes off weird, and you're like, I don't understand what they're saying. So I feel like that's a problem that a lot of play adaptations, like in the Shakespeare era, have.
It kind of goes back to what you were talking about sort of like the shift in acting from like, or like you mentioned, like we talked about like The Godfather
Mm-hmm.
to um Goodfellas. What I always like to talk about is a streetcar name, or actually Brando,
Yeah.
Streetcar Named Desire, On the
Yeah.
Waterfront. That was sort of right around the era, like right around the 50s, where
Mm-hmm.
the shift happened from kind of like you were talking about, where like if you watch movies in the 30s and 40s,
Mm-hmm.
there was some more like very good introspective sort
Mm-hmm.
of like subtle performance. But throughout that era, like the Jimmy Stewart era, the Capra era, all that stuff, even the Chaplin era, there was a very more everything was very pronounced.
Yeah.
Everything talked like
Yeah.
very theatrical and it was very
Yeah.
epic. Whereas when it came to like it was right around the 50s.
Yeah.
Well, I mean like before that, but Brando was really the one who sort of
Yeah.
changed the game where it was more
Eli
about these sort
Kazan.
of exactly these
Yeah.
more very sort of like internal acting, not very, theatrical or
Yeah.
like classical theatrical, and that's really where the paradigm shifted. Um,
Well, yeah, Streetcar Named Desire is I mean literally I think the turning point for that, because you have Brando who's representing the more method acting of the modern of what would come of the modern era, but you also have Vivian Lee who is much more in the classical era of obviously Gone with the Wind and that kind of era. So to have the two of them together in that role is and again the film is kind of, or the I mean the play too is obviously about that. The kind of she represents the kind of old school, you know, values and stuff like that, and he's like the more modern, gross, kind of a person. So that I mean that really I think is the defining movie that separates the previous generation and new.
yeah, and Blanche was like, she's almost she like and the film, she's literally like, it's established that she's like mentally ill and she's almost like living in a quasi fantasy, and it kind of almost works perfectly where she almost like thinks she's in a movie or in a play. Like everything she does is very like theatrical and like epic. And then Brando's just like walking around like an ape or something, just kind of like like smacking his gum or whatever. Um, have you just not really the best subway segue? Are you familiar at all with sort of Scorsese's like lesser known films?
Probably not. No. Like which
Uh,
ones?
s- like for example, well, there were like his his first ones. Who's Knocking on My Door with Keitel.
Mm-mm.
Um, Even Mean Streets, I guess, is well. It's I feel like Mean Streets kind of gets forgotten, like especially when it like aside from Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, King of Comedy, Mean Streets is still heralded, but it's one of the films where I feel like even some like big Scorsese fans haven't actually seen that one.
I haven't seen Mean
Um,
Streets.
oh, definitely check it out. It
Yeah.
was Keitel. It was actually his first film with De Niro.
Yeah.
Johnny, and he plays the Johnny Boy character. He's where it's not a leading role, but
Yeah.
he's still excellent in it. Um, One film that I actually really admire of his, and this is actually coming from someone who's not religious at all.
Last
Um,
Temptation of Christ.
The Last Temptation of Christ with Willem Dafoe, and funny enough, I remember seeing so the background of it is the film is about Jesus Christ, the last temptation by the devil before he was to
Yeah.
sacrifice himself for the sins of humanity. And
Yeah.
um, what I actually watched an interview with Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel on the film, and at the time when it came out, the film was like, I mean, even to this day, probably like there were a lot of religious people who were like,
Yeah.
"Fuck this shit! Like, what
Yeah.
the fuck is this shit?" Because it framed Jesus as a man who was very flawed, and like
Yeah.
he was actually tempted by the devil to
Yeah.
maybe forgo his
Yeah.
purpose with his father. But at least for me, I thought that made him the story so much more
Yeah.
touching, where it was
Yeah.
like Jesus, he wasn't this like perfect, even from like a straight storytelling perspective, he wasn't this perfect, all knowing, infallible person. He was this person who had doubts and fears
Hmm.
and temptations, and he overcame them. Um, and yet it's so funny how even to this day the film is like it's hated by some,
Yeah.
even though I think it actually makes the story that so much more what's what I'm looking for, rich and
Yeah.
almost moving in a way.
I definitely agree. I seen Last Temptation of Christ once when I was younger, but that's one of the ones I always forget is one of his movies. Like it's so different than like anything else he did before that, or or since then either. Um, Again, it's one of those things where it's like when I saw on Wikipedia, because I had the list up here for discussion purposes, it's like, wait, he did Last Station of Christ? It doesn't jive with the rest of his stuff for me. Again, at least with my limited recollection, I've seen it once, but yeah, definitely very different than everything else.
Yeah, but it just goes to show how good of a director he is. He did Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Ellen Burstyn won Best Actress for that role. And that's a film where if you watch it, you're like, he made this film between Mean Streets and Taxi Driver, and you watch the film and you're like, what the fuck? he he made this film. It's about like a single mother, like just like a melodrama. Age of Innocence with Daniel Day Lewis, Hugo, which was a pretty good movie. I think he said he made that specifically so like his like grandkids could actually watch a film of his, and I was like,
Yeah,
oh,
that's
that's
another
sweet.
one. I never watched it. I saw the commercials and stuff, and I remember I was thinking like, what the fuck is this? Like, that's another one where it's like, yeah, you're right. This does not seem like him at all.
Well, I think there was a time where it's funny you mentioned earlier talking about how De Niro kind of fell into typecast roles. I think that happened around Goodfellas. Before that, because like you said, Taxi Driver, Mean Streets, Raging Bull, King of Comedy, New York, New York. He did a lot of like very different variable work. Awakenings with Robert Williams, that was another good one. I think it was around Goodfellas where he kind of fell into his typecast roles. Funny enough, because that's what happened to Pacino. Because during the 70s and 80s, Pacino had a lot of Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Godfather. He had a lot of range. But after Scent of a Woman came out and the hoo-ah and all that stuff, that's it almost like that's what he became known for. Like being like the I'm Al Pacino, the hoo-ah and all that shit.
I think some of that's unfortunately due to his voice too. His
Yeah,
voice
definitely.
changed because of the smoking later on in life, and he couldn't do again the early stuff that he does could be vulnerable and weird, and it was great like Dog Day Afternoon, fucking fantastic. But yeah, once the voice kind of set in, it's like yeah, I guess I'm doing gangster pictures. Like this is what I can kind of do, which is sad because again he has such incredible race. Early work's fucking fantastic. I wanted to talk briefly about The Irishman. I know we're hitting our hour here, but maybe we can talk for like 5 minutes about it. Um, I I did not like The Irishman.
Oh yeah, me neither. No, I I appreciated it more than I
I
liked it.
appreciated it too, but I didn't like it, and I think there was two things I didn't like about it. One, it felt very much a throwback to the Goodfella eras, which I was like, come on, I think we've kind of moved past this a little bit, Scorsese. But two, I also, this is gonna sound kind of mean. It's the age, like I didn't like seeing De Niro in like an old folks' home playing a gangster. I was just like, bro, you were the height of fucking power and machismo in Goodfellas and stuff like that. To see him kind of struggling, even in the scenes when he was supposed to be young, I was like, just let De Niro retire in grace. Don't make him play a gangster again. Like this is not convincing at all for me.
Well, I think, well, it's hard too because the issue with the Irishman was that, well, I thought Pacino and Pesci did excellent. De Niro, it's not that he didn't do it's not that he didn't do a good job. The issue was that um he kind of, like we were talking about before about how Scorsese is very good at like dressing down the mob. Like he like good with Goodfellas, there's always that, like there's that hint of irony throughout the entire film. Even Casino, which is sort of a companion piece, same deal. Whereas with the Irishman, I kind of didn't. I mean, like obviously at the end of the film, it's very clear of like the last hour of that film is like depressing as fuck. Like it's like it like really hits you over the head, almost to a fault of like this this lifestyle will like fuck your life up. Um, but the issue there is the character of Frank Sheeran. I felt like he wasn't very interesting. He just kind of was very one note. He was, I mean, like he kind of probably was a sociopath. He was a contract killer. So like he wasn't as interesting as say like Pacino's Jimmy Hoffa, or any of his other previous characters, De Niro. So yeah, I almost felt like it's not that he did a bad job. It's just that the character was just so kind of flat and boring. Where I was just kind of like, and De Niro's trying to make it. He doesn't really have that much to work with. And like there were a few scenes where when he was given stuff to work with, like the scene where he tells Jimmy, you know, it is what it is. Like that was a great scene. But yeah, it almost felt like he was sort of he almost felt like the Henry Hill of this film, where he's almost more of like a secondary character to sort of like showcase everyone else.
I felt like the pacing that we talked about that makes Goodfellas so good was lost a little bit here too, because the film is too
Absolutely.
fucking long. It's way too fucking long, and you lose some of that easy to watch nature.
And I don't mean to say that on, and this is like because a lot of people might like misconstrue us when we say this. We're not saying that long films are bad. There are films that Lawrence of Arabia. I love that film. It's almost 4 hours long. Gone. Well, I haven't seen Gone with the Wind. Maybe it is, but
Gone
like,
with the
yeah,
Wind's very
Lawrence.
good too, and it moves very quickly for this 4 hour run.
Yeah, but then there are films where, like, I have seen films that are like 90 minutes long that I think should have been 2 hours. It needed the extra time. But then I've seen 3 hour films where I'm like, this film could have been like 2 hours. I think The Irishman was like probably like an hour too long, to be completely honest. It did not have to be, it was 3.5 hours. I did, no, you did not need that. Nope. No, 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 no.
And it's interesting too because he made this for Netflix, right? Like that's they were behind the production.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how it works with net because I whenever it's like a streaming service movie, I never really know like
But that's what it was
how it works.
advertised as, like, yeah, this is a Netflix, original Scorsese movie. And I just think that, like, I think they probably just gave him too much freedom in this because they're like, this was Netflix's selling point for this movie. It's like, we got a
It was.
Scorsese movie. Come sign up for this. Like, it's going to be awesome. And they're like, yeah, make it as long as you fucking want because it's going to be great. And I just think it needed a little bit more restraint in that regard. But yeah, I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot of, what makes Scorsese such an incredible director. I think a lot of that is encompassed in the film Goodfellas. I know we talked about a lot of different movies, but yeah, obviously one of the most incredible directors of all time, and his contribution to film, the gangster genre, which is so important to me, right? Like there would be no Sopranos without Goodfellas. Um, is Yeah, it can't be understated.
Funny enough that we were just talking about that because I was gonna say I'm actually excited for um his next film, Killers of
Oh, the flower,
Flower Moon,
yeah, yeah.
which apparently it just was released that the film is gonna be over 3 hours. I think like 3 hours and 15, 20 minutes.
Ew.
Um, which is
And this
another
one's
where
made
I'm
for Apple
like,
TV, so I wonder if it's going to be another repeat of The Irishman.
yeah, where I'm like, and it's funny too because it's like I'm looking back at all his films, and it's like he never was sort of like a long movie guy. Like Goodfellas was 2 hours and 20 minutes. Taxi Driver was two. Raging Bull was two. Mean Streets was two. He never was. I guess Casino was three. And then like
Casino,
it
and
almost.
I felt Casino was a little too long too. I felt it
Yeah,
kind
I
of
agree.
meandered a little bit.
Yeah, it was very extremely well made, but a little. Where I actually some funny enough, that was a big debate of where people compare Casino and Goodfellas. I think Casino is in some ways more polished than Goodfellas. But I don't. It's hard because like when I'm trying to compare the two, I think Casino is like a better film technically in terms of like its technical abilities and it's more polished, I guess. Where Goodfellas, it did feel a bit rougher in some areas, but I don't. For me, Goodfellas, like it was like there's a certain magic to it that where it's just I don't know what it is. It just everything about it is the pacing. I think that's it for me. The pacing is just unbelievable. I don't know. It's like a miracle film.
I think Casino, again, a really, really good film. I think he got a little carried away indulging the Goodfellas, vibe that he got from, because
Yeah,
obviously that was a smash success, and it's like we're gonna do Goodfellas again, but slightly different. And I think when it's not kind of indulging itself too much in that vibe, it's a really good film. But when it goes kind of more on that end, it's like, yeah, we could have probably had a little bit more, cutting here, taking a little bit more out of here. But I am excited to see, Killers of the Flower Moon too. It'll be very interesting to see him in a western. It'll be very interesting. The casting is obviously fantastic. You got DiCaprio and De Niro here, so we'll see how they play off of each other. Um,
real quick, I know we have to wrap up, but something that I remember hearing this theory, just to go back to Taxi Driver, because I thought about it when we were talking about it. Have you heard? So obviously, in the film, Travis Bickle is a Vietnam veteran, and he comes back from the war, and he struggled with PTSD and isolation. Have you heard the theory that he actually isn't a Vietnam veteran? So the theory goes, I don't think I don't think this is like correct because I think him being a Vietnam veteran was like it was the point of the film was supposed to be like this is how a lot of the veterans felt coming back stateside, but there's never actual confirmation in the film. I don't think like for sure that he actually ever was in the war, and some have theorized that given his personality, a person who like, he sort of has like this grandiose view of himself, that what if he almost like made up that narrative for himself to kind of feel like special in a sense. And I was like, holy fuck, that's actually kind of badass. I don't think that's true at all, but it is kind of cool to think about.
I mean, I think the film leaves it open for interpretation. Again, how much of what we're seeing is real? How much of it is just a delusion in his head?
Mhm.
And I think it's very much intentional to question Travis Bickle as a character. I thought you were going to bring up the fact that Harvey Keitel's character, the pimp, was originally supposed to be a black character.
Oh yeah, we could make a whole episode
That,
on
that
that.
I didn't bring it up because I was like I knew that was going to be a huge thing we're going to talk about, but that almost ruins the movie a little bit. Like not really, but like the racial angle of the film, which is very much a part of the undercurrent of what's going on. The whole scene with Scorsese himself in the taxi. There's a whole thing when he's talking to the senator and about cleaning up the streets. There's this whole kind of subtextual racism in the film that's very much part of the character. But they cast Harvey Keitel because they're like if we show the scene at the end with him blowing away a black character like this, it might lead to riots.
I actually think weren't all the characters in the final scene supposed to be black?
I think it was supposed to be a black
Yeah.
operation, and there's this whole again racist thing to it where of him being in it. I think that would have made the film a lot better, I think, to show that. It would have, again, I think it made him less sympathetic too. People would be able to kind of pick up on a lot of the darkness in him. But
Funny enough,
unfortunately, that's what we got.
where you mentioned that, where when I was talking about like people like are weirdly like sympathetic, one of the biggest like one of the big discussions from that movie is is or like one of the like I don't want to say this like to be like dismissive or like to be like to be poo poo them, but like sometimes I'll see like a Reddit bro and they'll be like, so was Travis really racist though? And I'm like, oh no, because it's like even if you
With the
watch
Harvey
the
Keitel
film,
casting, I think
well,
it's much more like ugh.
yeah, well, I mean, like if you watch the film, there are a lot of pretty obvious hints. Like there's the scene where, there's like that. There's actually that one really great shot that Scorsese does, where Travis is walking down the street, and there's like a group of black guys coming towards him, and then Travis turns and looks at them, but as they're doing it, the camera cuts and it zooms in close on one of the black guys' face, and then there's a reverse shot of Travis looking at him like very like almost sort of like that moment was supposed to be a very like um a very sort of like filmmaking language of like it's trying to communicate an idea, and I it's hard because it almost I agree where I almost kind of think the film would be better if at the end it went with the original ending and all the people he kills are black. However, on the other hand, I almost wonder, is it kind of because like I mean, I guess not in the 70s as much, but like even today a lot of racism and bigotry isn't really most of what we talk about. We're not talking about these, we're not talking about like KKK members like, yeah, white pride. We're talking about people just sort of, general people who don't actually present themselves as racist, but sometimes they'll make comments or they'll have certain inclinations or, it's almost like sort of like a subconscious sort of thing where they don't even, but if you ask them, they'd be like, oh, of course I'm not racist. But yeah, so I almost, but yeah, on the other hand, I'm kind of like, I kind of wish they went with the original ending.
Yeah, but again, I
Yeah.
mean, it's still a fantastic movie. I mean, and no insult to Harvey Keitel, right? He does a fantastic job, and it's just the area it was made in. They were worried about that.
I think, to your point, because you said you liked him, I think Tarantino actually said that it would have been a fatal flaw of the film, but because Harvey Keitel was so good in the role that it saved the movie.
It did, yeah. But we reached our hour plus here, so thank you all for sticking with us and talking about these movies. And stay tuned for the next episode of No One's a Critic coming soon.
Take care, y'all.